you could not get tenure in a biology department with very, very few exceptions.
In this week's episode, I had the pleasure of interviewing the chief economist at Microsoft, Michael Schwarz. Dr. Schwarz is a microtheorist who works on problems in an applied field of economics called market design. In our talk, we discussed his career as a former professor at Harvard University, as well as his transition into industry, where he's worked for such giants as Yahoo, Google, and now Microsoft, as well as the scientific discoveries he made within industry working on practical problems around the designing of auctions. He shared with me his opinions about the enduring importance of economic theory, even in an age of data. I am your host, Scott Cunningham, and this is Mixtape Podcast. All right, so it's my pleasure to get to talk with Michael Schwarz, chief economist at Microsoft, who's gracious enough to let me talk to him a little bit about his life and his time in industry. Michael, thank you so much for letting me talk to you on the podcast.
Oh, thank you. My pleasure.
So before we get into your time in industry, I wanted to talk a little bit about your pre-industry time. There's this interesting thing I found on the internet that you have your PhD and your master's, but no undergraduate degree. And I was curious about that's probably a small set of people. Can you tell me about that?
Sure. It's a long story, or it's a very short story. I did a couple of years of undergrad in Moscow. I was born in Moscow, and I lived in Moscow till I was 20 years old. Maybe now more than ever, I could say there's never a bad time to leave Russia. So 1990 surely seemed like a very good year to leave Russia. Although obviously 2022 could very much compete with it. With a couple of years of undergrad behind my belt, I thought, well, I want to get out of this place. At that time, there were no Russian students, no students from the Soviet Union in the US. I mean, there were some Russian immigrants, but like a foreign student wasn't an existing concept for Soviet people. So I started kind of exploring how to get out of Russia and go to the US. I didn't get the best information because, well, at that time, it's not like there were other cohorts of foreign students coming from the Soviet Union to the US. I got an impression that the way it works is that there were good programs in the US, and those were called the graduate school. They were good and they were free, and they were for good students. And then there were not so good programs in the US. They were called undergraduate programs. Those were for bad students who have to pay a lot of money to be in school. So my 19-year-old self created this mental picture, and it worked. I applied to graduate school in physics without having an undergraduate degree, and I went.
Yeah, that's right. It's right. Your life could have been totally different if you tried to get into it, gone and done the undergrad. It worked out perfect. How'd you get interested in economics? How'd you go from physics into economics?
I think physics and economics, I think, are philosophically very similar. I think in many ways, economics tries to be like physics in a methodological sense, right? So, for example, if you go to any physics department, you will see that there are theoretical physicists and there are applied and experimental physicists. Mm-hmm. If you go to any economics department, you will see that there are economic theorists and there are applied and experimental economists. If you go to a biology department, you will not find biological theorists. Mm. You could not get tenure in a biology department. There's very, very few exceptions for being a theoretical biologist. Same goes for, say, chemistry, right? So in this respect, economics and physics are kind of philosophically similar. And I was interested in theoretical physics, and I was fascinated by economic theory. Mm. And I think that that distinction is actually somewhat, it's not intrinsic to a discipline. Right. I could imagine another institutional structure where every biology department has several theoretical biologists who teach biological theory, and then has experimental biology to teach experiment. I could imagine that world. It's easy to imagine that world. That world is possible. It just doesn't exist. Right. I could also imagine a world where there are no economic theorists. Yeah. Where it's not a category. Yeah. Where there are kind of applied economists and they do some theory, they do some applied work, and it's a mix. Just like we see in biology, right? There are certainly biologists who are thinking about very deeply about biological systems, but none of them are theoretical biologists. In fact, in biology, you couldn't publish a theory paper. Yeah. Yeah. You can have an absolutely brilliant theory in biology. You will submit it to Nature. It would be rejected because there is no experiment to confirm it. You can submit it to second and third and fourth tier journal, and it will be rejected every time. So that's kind of the norms of the discipline. And it's kind of somewhat endogenous. Yeah, yeah. And somewhat exogenous. Somewhat is just historical coincidence. Right. Well, I don't want to get off track, but now that you say that, part of the trend of academic economics over the last 100 years has been the somewhat of the shrinking of theory with the growth of empiricism. Does that what's your opinion about how the market or how the discipline has changed over the last 20, 30 years? Well, I think that so I'm not an economic historian, and I'm not a historian of economic thought. So I think that I'm not sure if assertion that there is kind of a monotonically decreasing role of theory in economics over the last 100 years. I'm actually not sure if this is empirically true. Maybe it is, maybe it is not. I'm not certain. My sort of impression, based on very little that I know about history of economic thought, is that there was a time during the 20th century where actually kind of the mind share and market share of economic theory was expanding. And in more recent decades, it declined. But I'm not sure if this is like a very steady trend. Yeah. For example, when you look at like economic science of 1920s and 1930s, at that time you don't see economic theory as we know it today. Yeah. Right. So at that time, economic theory, I think, in many ways, kind of some of it sounds almost like philosophy,
Right.
right? And then kind of with arrival of rigorous mathematical modeling in economics, kind of there's just this revolution that happens, and as a result, the mind share of economic theory increases, and then at some point it starts to decrease.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it starts to decrease for reasons I think I vaguely understand. I think those are good reasons. On the one hand, we got those wonderful toys that we all have on our desks right
Yeah.
now. We have extraordinarily powerful computers, so we can the cost of applied work declines dramatically, and at the same time, kind of the level of understanding and depth of understanding of theory that every economic graduate student has today is certainly not what it was half a century ago, right? Economists are much more expert in theory than they were half a century ago. So to some extent, you can say there's less economic theory. To some extent, you can say, well, actually, nowadays all of us are economic theorists. Like every empirical IO economist who does structural IO in some ways knows economic theory better than most economic theorists knew economic theory half a century ago. Maybe
I've
it's
never thought of it.
it isn't.
I've never thought of it that way. The stock.
And maybe that's also a reason. Maybe it's also a reason why graduate training in economics is getting longer.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it used to be the case that pretty much every MIT PhD was done in 4 years.
Yeah.
4 years, and you're out. Off we go.
Right.
And in other top programs like Stanford and Harvard and Yale, the norm was 4 years, but 5 was sort of okay.
Right.
So today, 4 is very rare. You don't see
Yeah.
people finishing a PhD in 4 years.
Yeah.
And 5 is considered short, 6 is common, 7 is not that uncommon. So the duration of an economic PhD program like increased by basically 50%.
Yeah. Yeah.
And part of it is that, well, I think we do learn a lot more.
Yeah. 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 Oh, that's fascinating. That's.
I mean, maybe I'm over optimistic. Right?
That's such a.
Maybe we just waste more time.
Yeah.
And that's possible too. But I'm a sometimes optimist. So I hope that we actually have a better trained generation of economists today.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. So this issue of theory and empiricism and computation, I feel like this is going to be a part of the thread that I'm wanting to have with you about economists in tech, but I don't also want to lead it. So I guess I just wanted to kind of talk a little bit about a couple of things, but I'll do it in the context of your life and what you've seen. So the backdrop is you're an assistant professor at Harvard. What year is this? So this is early 2000, late 90s, early 2000s?
I started in 1999.
And you were in the economics department at
I was in
Harvard?
the economics department.
At the economics department in Harvard. And you end up leaving and you go, tell me about so I'd love to hear the story of the decision for, the decision to actually exit academia and go into this early part of the growing of the tech market. And I just was kind of curious about where did that walk me through what information started to emerge where this actually looked like you could see yourself in this career that probably I'm assuming you had not seen for yourself before.
I certainly haven't seen that for myself because it didn't exist. But at the same time, I was actually in some ways exposed to it early on. So even as I was kind of applying to PhD programs, when I was choosing which program to go, again, I was pretty ignorant about how economic profession works, but I chose to go to Stanford Business School rather than my other options were top economics departments. And I thought, well, I want to go to business school because I want to maximize an option value. I'm a believer in maximizing option value early on in the career. And I thought, well, with a business school, I can probably do everything I can do after econ department, but I also could have a career in business. So that drove my choice. Right. And then as I was a business school student, I was actually exposed to tech very, very early on. My first exposure to tech was in mid-90s. So in mid-90s, I received IBM Cooperative Fellowship, and I did a summer internship at IBM Research Labs at Alma, which was, by the way, a great research lab. One of the researchers there was a physics Nobel Prize winner, and that was the place where hard drive was invented once upon a time. It was a spectacular building on top of a hill, built back in the days when IBM was perhaps the most beloved American company. By mid-90s, IBM was no longer on top of the hill as the company, but the lab was still on top of the hill. So it was an exciting place, and it was exciting to be an economist there. I was, I believe, the first and only economist who ever interned there. I don't know if I was the only one, but I'm quite certain I was the first one. So it was a really interesting experience. So I already had kind of this familiarity with corporate research and respect towards corporate research.
Yeah, sure.
And then as I was so after that experience, I continue working on my dissertation, and but kind of a few years later, after that internship, and still before I finished my PhD, HP Labs recruited me for their research lab. So I was kind of intrigued by the space. So for me, I think that the reason that I kind of ended up gravitating towards tech is that although I was a kind of pure theorist, I always felt that I want theory to be relevant. And it was very important for me. And what it meant for me was that whenever I had an opportunity to talk to practitioners, I used that opportunity. I seeked out that opportunity. So when I would write a paper, any paper, I would just try to go out and interview a bunch of practitioners.
Can you give me an example? Can you give me an example of like a paper that came out of something like that, or how you went about it?
Oh, sure. I can give you many examples. So, for example, I have a paper on standard adoption. And it's a theoretical paper about global games. It's very technical, has complicated theorems. It's joint work with Michael Ostrovsky, who was a student at Harvard at the time. So even though I kind of knew that my paper is about global games, I was like, hey, I want to understand better how people who actually set standards think about it. So I went out and I interviewed people. By interviewed, I simply mean I would email people and say, hey, could I have a lunch with you? Could I have a coffee with you? Could I have a phone call with you? And people are pretty friendly.
Yeah.
It's actually not that difficult to get an hour, half an hour of someone's time.
Yeah.
So I would just talk to them and listen and try to learn how they think about the world and what are the issues and the challenges that they run into as they create the standards that power the internet, that power our devices. So for me, it's kind of just a reflex. Whenever I work on something or even interested in something, I start talking to practitioners and I try to understand their point of view.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's actually how I ended up in tech. So I'm a market designer. I'm
Right.
basically, so I'm interested in mechanism design. So when I learned about sponsored search auctions, I thought, oh, that's an interesting auction. It's not clear what kind of equilibrium it has. So I, together with Michael Ostrovsky and Ben Edelman, who are both former Harvard students, I worked out a model of the equilibrium in that auction, and kind of my first reflex was, well, I want to meet people who are in that business.
Who was designing these auctions before the economists were involved?
Oh, that's an interesting story. So that's a story I heard from Halvarian. So I'm blinking on the name of a person who came up with the concept of generalized second price auction. He was an engineer. I think his specialty was vision. And he was, I think he was a Caltech undergrad and he took like one course in economics. So he knew what a second price auction was, but kind of vague recollection from an undergraduate class. So what's interesting, and again, it's a hearsay. I didn't know that person, and I just heard stories.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that he kind of used this logic of second price auction to create generous second price auction to sell advertisement.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating is that it seems that he actually understood, like my first conjecture was that generous second price auction was basically an erroneous implementation of VCG. Right, and that person didn't know what VCG was because he just took one undergraduate course in Caltech that probably had half a lecture on second price auction. I don't believe that person knew VCG, although who knows. But what's interesting is that he actually understood that generalized second price auction was not incentive compatible because apparently Halvarian told me that he dug out some memo written by that person where he says, well, we can use this auction. It's very, very simple. It's intuitive. And yes, people may not be bidding that true value. And then he, presumably in that note that I never read, presumably he says that he thinks he understands how to work out the payments that would kind of make people bid the true value, but it's probably not worth the effort or something like that.
Wow. Wow. How many pre-econ auction things are being, developed across tech at the beginning before people like you and Varian and others were coming out there? Is this, it was just like, was everybody kind of like, doing what this gentleman was doing? Sort of, we need an auction, somebody creates an auction, and we later learn it sort of has these unique properties?
Well, I think the only auctions that I am aware of are like the only. I mean, obviously there's a auctions have been used since since more than 2,000 years.
Yeah.
So obviously, the very long history of auctions.
Yeah.
But I believe in tech. The first application of auctions that I'm aware of, and maybe I'm just forgetting something completely obvious, but I think the first application of auctions that I am aware of was by Overture, that was later acquired by Yahoo, where they use what I call generalized first price auction. Where you kind of rank people according to bids, and then you pay per click, but you pay what you bid. And that you can see that there's no pure strategy equilibrium in that model. So bids are unstable. And you see, as an empirical matter, things are kind of going crazy because it's to your benefit to change your bid in response to whatever your competitors are doing, and there is no pure strategy equilibrium. So it's an infinite dance, which is inefficient. It's both inefficient in terms of misallocating advertising space, but it's also inefficient in terms of people's time. It's not friendly, right? I mean, you don't want to be penalized in terms of worse performance just because you don't bother to write some kind of script that would constantly change your bid.
Yeah.
So that was kind of the original application of auctions, at least for sponsored search advertisement. So then later Google improves upon it, where they decide to also start selling sponsored search advertisement via auction. And they say, oh, we see that there's this problem, those things are not stable. So instead of charging the bid, they charge the bid of an advertiser who is right below you.
Yeah. So this early, so now I have so many. I feel like I want to talk to you forever, but I want to now, I guess, talk to you about this just like a thing that, just as you were talking, I just now am sort of piecing together things that I didn't see as connected. I don't fully see as connected yet, but this thing on your Wikipedia page says, in 2006, Business Week reported that Schwarz and two of his students had cracked Google's AdWords code. And I was curious, what is that talking about?
Oh, so that's a funny story. So when when we wrote this paper that characterized the equilibrium of generalized second price auction, we we started circulating the paper. We presented it at the VR meetings, and of course we didn't know if Google knew those results. So we send that paper to Halvarian and say, hey, Hal, what do you think? And at that, and Hal told us, oh, I know all of this. And we said, wow, you do? That's, we don't know what to say, but okay, we believe you. Would you like to maybe join us on this paper?
Right.
Actually, no, he said that he didn't publish those results because he wasn't allowed to publish it, because it's a trade secret that Google used. And he said, okay. And then after our paper was kind of publicly posted as an NBR working paper, or publicly posted online, I'm not sure. At that point, Hal got permission from Google to publish his paper because it was virtually identical to ours. It had so mm, uh, we had some extra results that Hull's paper doesn't have, but kind of the basic equilibrium result, not the uniqueness result, but the basic equilibrium result is exactly identical, which to me proves that it's a real science, right? Like when two people independently discover exactly identical things, just exactly
Right.
the same,
Right.
that's when you know it's science.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's the story. And then I guess as journalists interviewed, I don't know whom, they must have learned that story. It's like, so that was Google's trade secret. So, okay, we cracked the Google code.
That's great.
Okay, we did. But it's a very useful result. Like, even the reason that Google kept it as a trade secret, I think, is a very useful result. When you change anything in the auction, it allows you to run all kinds of counterfactuals. And obviously, that's a much, much cheaper way to optimize your system, to analytically figure out counterfactuals, rather than deploy a change, wait for 3 months, see what happened with revenues, and hope you figured out if that change is good or not.
Yeah.
It's very useful.
You know, there's this book by I think his name's Robert Heilbroner called "The Worldly Philosophers," and it's funny us talking right now. It's like, you know, to listen to you talk, it's you know, it's like talking to a timeless kind of. I mean, I don't mean this to flatter you. I just mean like it's like talking to one of these timeless, you know, classic economists, and it's so interesting that at the same time, the things that you're sitting here thinking so deeply about have been so valued by Google and Yahoo and Microsoft. And it's interesting that that's not something that I usually thought of with like philosophers, but it's interesting to think about the worldly philosophers. It's so valuable what you're doing for these giant parts of society. And I just was curious, what exactly has been the if you could sort of break down in this hedonic regression of the elements of your skill set that has been really valued by Google and Yahoo and Microsoft repeatedly over and over and time again. What exactly has been those core value added that's like part of you and maybe even part of PhD economists in general?
Well, I think that right now, in many ways, we live in times that many economists would describe as kind of diminishing importance of theory. And I don't think I subscribe to that notion, at least not fully. But I think that economic theory, is actually enormously useful. I'm a big believer in usefulness of economic theory, and I know it's useful because that's how I make my living, by applying it to practice. So obviously, my team has many applied economists, econometricians, data scientists. That's very, very important. But theory is becoming more important in the time of cheap compute. And the reason is that models, like, you could not, no matter how much data you have, there's always, you always need some sort of structure to think about the world. And theory is something that offers that structure. So of course you want to use the data, you want to be, you don't just want to philosophize and theorize, but also you want to guide your usage of data by theory. And by the way, that's what applied economists do. Right? That's the difference between applied economist and a data scientist who kind of looks at the data without trying to come up with a conceptual framework. And that conceptual framework is very valuable. And that's what theory has to offer. So I think that the problem with theory to some extent, is that there are a lot of theorists who kind of forgot that theory is out there to provide a useful framework for applications, not necessarily immediately.
Right.
I'm a big fan of theory that may not be useful for the next 10, may not be practically useful for the next 10 years. But I think we all have to be thinking, how is that framework going to be actually helpful in practice? And I think there are kind of two types of economic theorists. Economic theorists who come, like, I'll give you one example without naming names. One very smart economic theorist asked me, it's like, hey, I have this really clever model. You're really good in kind of getting really good application examples. Could you help me out here to like come up with an illustration of that model? And like, actually, that's not how it works. It's first you look at the fault, and then you try to kind of find a model that would be useful. So I think some of the theory that we see may be very clever and kind of intellectually fascinating, but then kind of the applications are an afterthought.
Yeah.
And that's not the kind of applied theory that would be useful. I think that it really has to come from observing reality and finding something that's finding a framework of thinking about it that's useful.
Yeah. What has been so when you're doing that work, when you're doing that kind of work, and you're working for Google or Microsoft or Yahoo, what is it that makes them say, we see in what Michael is doing, and it's producing value for us enough that we want him or people like him? What has it been what was it like at the beginning of your career, and maybe what is it like now in like industry in general?
Could you a little bit elaborate on the question?
Well, so you're, in some ways what you've described about the production of theory, it's like its value. It almost feels like pure science, even though it's about, it's about theoretical models that help you understand the world. I could imagine what you said in your response, you would have said had you stayed at Harvard, but you were sucked into industry. And so I'm wondering, what was it that, what is it that other people think you bring to the firm? What is it that they see?
Well, I think that
is it the same as what our departments are looking for?
Most of the things are extremely specific, right? So let me just start with my work at Yahoo. So I joined Yahoo about more than 15 years ago, and at that time, most of Yahoo revenues were coming from advertisement, both display and sponsor search. So most of my work at Yahoo was in ad monetization, both for display ads and for sponsored search. And it had a very well documented, very tangible impact on the corporate bottom line. For example, we used optimal auction design theory to estimate optimal reserve prices for enormous number of keywords and keyword combinations. I mean, we are talking about like millions, right?
Yeah.
So it has to be done algorithmically. You couldn't have a smoky room where people decide what a reasonable reserve price would be, right? It's all algorithmic.
Yeah.
So we did that, and we launched that, and it made enormous amount of money for the company. So much so that in the earning call, then president of Yahoo said, "Well, this moved our quarterly earnings."
Wow.
So that was one of the kind of high impact projects, and that wasn't the only one. I designed some of the algorithms for pricing display advertisement and so on and so forth. So that's just very tangible value. You have to have algorithms that run your pricing decisions, many other decisions, and that creates tangible, measurable value. You have a treatment group, you have a control group. Some of the time you can measure quite precisely what the impact was. Some of the time it's much harder to say what the impact was.
Yeah. Do you think that that when you think about the labor market now for PhD economists, it seems like it's much more common now for a new graduate to, Amazon, Microsoft, everybody posts on Joe. And so there's much more they're a big part of the demand for the new minted PhD economists. What does it seem like the kinds of value that economists bring that is sort of making them, what is it that firms in industry now are really looking for to be, what are they trying to identify that makes a PhD economist really attractive hire?
Well, I think that right now we live in many ways, we live in the age of data. And knowing statistics is not enough to get business insight from the data that translates into value. I mean, sometimes it's enough. Obviously, there are plenty of successful statisticians and data scientists out there, but it is very valuable to think about what are the important business questions that we can answer with this data. What are the product changes and features that we can build using this data, using insights derived from that data? And that's, I think, where economic training becomes very valuable, where it kind of meets data science. So I think there's a huge complementarity between the two. And I think that's where the value is. And in my opinion, economists have the most value for things that are new. So for example, right now, I personally don't do any work on sponsored search advertisement. And the reason is that it's kind of a mature industry, relatively mature, right? So that low-hanging fruit that I could easily harvest 15 years ago is no longer there. So I think that when you look at something new, as an economist, I can come in and say, look, because I understand the theory, I can think about it better and deeper than any practitioner, because there are no practitioners who have a lot of experience with that thing, because it's new. So fast forward 10 years, you have a bunch of practitioners who have deep intuition, who have enormous institutional knowledge, who have great rules of thumb. And then you come in as an economist and say, oh, I can model it, I can think about it. And practitioners who are in it for 10 years, they go, well, maybe they don't have like the same conceptual framework, but they figure everything out one way or the other. And the marginal value that an economist could create there is much, much lower. On the other hand, you come in somewhere where there are no practitioners because it's new, and you are bringing conceptual framework. You can think about it before it happened, before there's a long history from which to learn, and that's where the value is. So to some extent, I think that the position of an economist in tech is paradoxical. Let's think about it this way, especially an economic theorist. If economic theory is right, then it is impossible for me to make a living in tech. Impossible. It's theoretical impossibility, because if economic theory is right, every economic agent perfectly solves every model that I could write and does absolutely optimal thing. Well, if every economic agent does an optimal thing, how in the world am I supposed to make a living telling economic agents what to do?
Yeah.
They know what to do. They solved all the models, including the models I couldn't solve.
Right.
So if economic theory is right, economic theory is useless, completely useless. Well, if economic theory is completely wrong, well, then it ain't useful either. Fortunately for me, economic theory is not completely right. Of course, nobody could perfectly solve all the models, but it's not completely wrong either. It's just roughly right. So that by applying those models, we can say something that is directionally right and useful. And it's particularly useful before there are people with experience who kind of really figured out how to solve those problems by trial and error and so on and so forth. But early on, when practitioners haven't quite figured out the solutions, and we can sort of approximately figure things out, that's where economic theory is most useful. And that is why kind of my entire career, both myself and my team, try to chase the wave of innovation, try to go to things that are new and novel, and where there is not yet a set of practitioners who kind of have the wealth of intuitions that we don't have. So that's why when I was in Google, I was in charge of developing a carpooling platform with matching and pricing algorithms for that. That platform was heavily hurt by the pandemic. It still exists as a Waze carpool. That's why at Microsoft, me and my team work on things like Azure. We work with Game Pass when it was kind of a new Microsoft offering. We work with pretty much anything that is new and novel, right? Like how do you price Copilot? How do you estimate the impact of Copilot on developer productivity? Like all those questions, something that's new, something that's novel, that's where economic theory and economists are most useful. Something where you have practitioners who are doing something for 15 years, they figured it out better than we can.
Figured it out. Well, I know that you have to run. This has been really such a neat opportunity to get to talk to you and listen to your thoughts on all these things. I just want to thank you so much for letting me interview you for the podcast and to learn more about you.
Thank you, Scott. It was a pleasure. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Okay. Bye-bye.